Hi, I'm Colin Ong, and I'd like to talk to you about fiscal policy. And if I have time in this recording, I'll link it to monetary policy. When you talk about fiscal policy, you refer mostly to government taxation, government spending, and they are linked to what we call balanced budget. Balanced budget means the amount you spend, all right, and the amount you tax is similar. The amount you spend and amount you subsidize is also linked to the topic of market failure, market intervention. So the importance of fiscal policy is that it bridges the microeconomic topic of market failure. Market failure, the starting of market failure is the relationship between the two parties, the buyer and the seller. Demand curve, supply curve. We call it price mechanism. But where there is externalities, the government intervenes. That's where the fiscal policy comes in. It's like a link. So if you're doing a microeconomic question, normally the ending wouldn't be just market failure, but how the government solves the market failure. And sometimes they call it price controls too. So measures that the government does, and that's under the purview of fiscal policy. But do not forget that whenever we talk about fiscal policy, we must also talk about how the fiscal policy is being financed. And when normally finance, we talk about taxation. Taxation, you have direct tax and indirect tax. So why is it so complicated in economics? It's complicated because when you have indirect tax, which in Singapore is called goods and services tax or GST, it's obvious that there is inflationary pressure, or we call it cost push inflation. So the strange thing is that the government is trying to solve a market failure using fiscal policy, right? And but when you're talking about if the government is austere or austerity, this fiscal austerity, they try to justify the spending by assuming they increase the GST. So there's inflationary pressure on that angle. And and when government spends by the spending G, which you learn in aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus X plus M, the G itself is a multiplier effect, right? So the government spends, there's a multiplier effect, there's an increase in economic growth, assuming that increased national income leads to economic growth. But if the government taxes, there is a negative pull backwards, right? Because they need to finance that expenditure. And in this case, it creates inflation. And unfortunately, inflation does have an impact on currency, which affects international trade. So when you study this topic of fiscal policy, you have to be very mindful. In your mind, you must remember that it's actually part of microeconomics, and it's the last part where the government tries to solve externality. Unfortunately, in this way, creating debit laws. And on the other side, the government tries its best to push the economy along with government spending. Most of the time, if you're talking about supply side, the government will try to pay for the training to upskill the country. So normally when you talk about fiscal policy, you also talk about how the government is here to actually try to boost up supply side. And normally, how do you know it when you do your economics exams? With the term productivity. So that's fiscal policy for you. The new term that you need to know for your exams is obviously fiscal austerity. All right. And obviously, the most famous budget deficit financing, right? So these are terms that you need to know. Right. So take care.